Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here. It's been a while since I've done one of these just talking to camera videos. I'm a little bit nervous. Winter and late autumn for me feel like the time to sink myself into a proper chunky fantasy book, but unfortunately I have been in a big reading slump for a few weeks now, maybe even a month, and I just don't know if my brain is up to getting into a 500+ page fantasy. What I have been needing is really those small wins of finishing books rather than just starting them over and over again. And I also know that this is the time of year where a lot of people find themselves a little behind on their reading goals and maybe need something speedy to catch up. But if you, like myself, are a big fantasy sci-fi reader, it can be difficult to find books that aren't pages and pages and pages. So I thought today I would recommend some of my favourite short sci-fi and fantasy books that I think you could read in a day, depending on your reading speed. Most of these are under 200 pages. There are a couple of exceptions, but I will put on the screen how many pages each of these books are. So if you, like me, have been struggling to sink your teeth into a tome of a book, but really want that hit of escaping to another world, then hopefully you can find something here that will hit that spot for you. So let's get into it. So the first book I want to mention is Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. Fonda Lee is more widely known, I think, for the Jade City series, which I have not read, mostly because I don't tend to lean towards urban fantasy. But this one is very different in setting. This is about a woman called Esther whose family were torn apart by a manticore attack when she was very young. So now her goal in life is to train and bond with a giant roc, these giant, ruthless bird-like creatures that are the only match for manticores. The story follows her as she is paired with a fledgling roc called Zara. They grow together and she gets to know some of the other rukas, which is what the people bonded with the rocs are called, and eventually she ends up on the Empire's most dangerous ever manticore hunt. At its core, this is really a story about the connection between the ruka and the roc, and how the ruka has so much respect and love and awe for this massive violent creature, but that roc is never going to feel the same way back about that person. It's almost a story of unrequited love, and despite how short this book was, I felt like the main character's relationships with the other rukas around her was also really interesting. I think of the books I've read this year, this is one of the books I've read with the most satisfying ending. I felt like the way that this was wrapped up was, at least for me, the perfect way for this book to end. So that is Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. The next book I want to recommend is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. Now this is the first in a duology of novellas, and I've heard that they actually pair really well together, but I have not gotten to the second one yet. I definitely need to soon because I really enjoyed this first one in the series, and it wasn't the kind of duology where this ended in a cliffhanger or anything like that. It's really not that kind of book, so I did still feel satisfied by this ending. This is set on an entirely different planet. I think it's actually a moon that this is set on, but this civilization has had their industrial revolution and they got to the point where they had intelligent robots working in their factories doing a lot of their jobs, but one day the robots just up and left, downed their tools and walked out into the forest to supposedly never be seen again. Centuries later, we follow the story of a tea monk who lives in what is now an almost idyllic world that is very focused on sustainability and living peacefully. It sounds so lovely, honestly. But this tea monk is grappling with the fact that they are still not happy even in this environment. They still don't feel fulfilled. So they decide to go on a sort of monastic journey throughout the countryside, visiting different villages and towns, serving tea and kind of therapy to the people in these settlements. And still they don't feel fulfilled. They feel like something is missing. So they themselves set off into the woods. And there they meet one of these long lost robots. This is a very philosophical story. A lot of this book is this monk and this robot kind of grappling with issues of meaning and purpose. If you are looking for a high stakes action plot, this is not the place for it. One thing I always remember when I think of this book is that the dedication in here just reads for anybody who could use a break, which is really what this book is. It is very calming and slow and gives you that room to really sit with your thoughts. If you are feeling overwhelmed by life, as you may be in our current circumstances, then I think that this is a really good one to sit down with and just take that break. So that is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. The next book on this list is Thornhedge by Kingfisher. This is a bit of a twisted retelling of the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale. I don't want to give away too much information about this one. Even reading the blurb feels like a little bit more information than I think would be ideal to start this with. All I will say is this tells the story of Toadling, who we find protecting a tower with a giant mass of thorns and brambles around it through the centuries. But one day, a valiant and kind knight from another land stumbles across her and really just refuses to leave her alone. It's quite frustrating. And at this point, she is very out of touch with the world around her. It's been so long since she really spoke to anyone else that the two of them begin to talk. But he's heard that there is a curse that needs breaking, and it is her job to do anything to stop that from happening. This book is a twisted version of the fairy tale, but honestly I think it is a lot cozier than I expected it to be going in. Our main character is so sympathetic, you can't help but care for her and yearn for her to be able to create a connection with somebody else. This also has a depiction of the Fae in here that is one of my favourite kinds. I really don't like when Fae are kind of just powerful people in books. I enjoy when they have that twisted nature to them because they are so unhuman and hard to understand, and I think this book captures that essence really, really well. If you want something that toes that line between a little bit of spook, a little bit of a dark twist on a fairy tale, and characters that you will really warm to and care about, then I would definitely go for Thornhedge by Kingfisher. The next book on this list is one that I simultaneously have mentioned several times on this channel but don't think I talk about enough. The more that I think about this book, even years after reading it now, the more I just marvel at it. And this is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mahtar and Max Gladstone. I don't tend to reread books these days just because I have so much to read, but this is the book that for the last few months I've really ached to reread just because the writing in here is so gorgeous. I think it's probably gonna have to happen soon. This is the story of Red and Blue, two rival secret agents in a galactic time war. Their jobs are to twist through time and space and make these tiny changes to history, kind of like the butterfly effect, that will turn the tide of the war in their side's favour. And one day, one of these agents leaves a note for the other one. These missives that they begin to leave for each other, which started as taunting, begin to develop into something more. And I don't just mean in words, in the way that the letters themselves are written, but in physically how they are left for each other. They become more and more complex because these are two secret agents who are incredibly good at their job and at leaving secret codes for each other. And the more connected they become, the more they need to hide it from their own factions and each other's. This is both one of the most beautifully written books that I've ever read and also very funny at times. The way that they write to each other with such snark is so wonderful. This is just the pinnacle of an enemies to lovers romance, really. I would say if you actively really care about plot that is fully spelled out and makes total sense, or if you care about a scientific system to a sci-fi world that makes total sense again, then this probably isn't the book for you. This is much more focused on grandeur and lyricism than it is on the nitty-gritty of how everything works. But that for me was perfect. I'm here for the vibes. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one. I know this one has been very popular over the last couple of years as well, but I think for such good reason. And I really just can't recommend enough This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mahtar and Max Gladstone. Next up we have The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This is definitely one of the heavier ones on this list, but I think it was really interesting and definitely worth a read. This is the story of Yetu, who is one of the Wujinru, who are essentially mer people. The crux of this story is that historically, African slave women who were being shipped across the sea were often thrown overboard if they were found to be pregnant and just left to drown. But in this version of our world, the babies of these women didn't just drown, they, being birthed underwater, turned into mer people. So there is now an entire community of these Wujinru under the water, and Yetu is their historian. This means that while the rest of her people are able to live their lives without the traumatic memories of how they ended up where they are and who they are, she has to take on all of that history. And of course this is incredibly overwhelming and unsustainable for her, so she runs away and heads up to the surface where she finds an entirely different world. The discussions of community in here, and also a lot of the delving into gender, I found to be really interesting, and I didn't expect for that to be a theme that would be explored in here so much. I know that the author, Rivers Solomon, is non-binary themselves, so clearly they wanted to weave that aspect into this story. And a bit of a fun fact that you'll probably only care about if you're a musical theatre person, but this story is actually based on a song by the group Clipping, which is also called The Deep if you want to check that one out. But this band, one of the members is Daveed Diggs, who played a big role in the original cast of Hamilton. So that was one of the reasons that I picked this book up initially, because I was a huge Hamilton fan as a teenager. But both pieces of media, I think, are just a really interesting concept and a really interesting lens to look at this subject through. So that is The Deep by Rivers Solomon. The next book I want to talk about is a little bit longer. I think it's around the 270 page mark. But I know that a lot of people on here are much faster readers than I am, and this has a bit of a mystery to it, which I think can often spur the reading process along. So this is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is one of the most interesting books I've ever read. This follows the character of Piranesi, who lives in the house. And this house is described to us through Piranesi's journal entries. He is very particular in the way that he keeps the notes he takes of his explorations throughout the house. This is not a normal house. This is a giant, sprawling work of architecture that is big enough to contain seas. And as far as Piranesi knows, he is the only one here except for a couple specific days of the week when he sees one other person that he calls the other. But one day strange messages start to be left in chalk on the pavement, and Piranesi knows there is someone new in the house. This again is one of those books that I think it is good to go into knowing very little about. It is at its core a mystery. We're trying to follow along with Piranesi as he unravels the world around him. This is some of the most interesting world building that I've read in a while, which is interesting because it's almost a locked room. There's a lot of repetition in here through vestibules and halls and courtyards, and the way that Piranesi writes about it is almost scientific, but I never felt bored by it. It just felt really intriguing. I think this is one of the most atmospheric books on this list, which I often find you can only get with a longer book. So if you are craving that kind of atmosphere of a different world that you can lose yourself in, but don't want to read something that's hundreds and hundreds of pages long, then I think this is a perfect one to go for. So that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. The next book I want to talk about is one that I only finished a couple of days ago, and this is Spear by Nicola Griffith. This is heavily steeped in Arthurian myth. It is the story of a girl who grows up with no name in a cave with just her mother, but as she grows she begins to have visions of a faraway lake from another land, and when she hears talk of King Arthos and his court at Caerleon, she knows that she needs to become a part of this court. And so she breaks from her mother, she leaves her behind and sets out into the world to find her destiny. There is a strange magic about her, and throughout the story she will fight great knights far beyond her power, meet sorceresses, and learn the truth about who she really is. This is also a sapphic retelling, which I really appreciated. Honestly, I had mixed feelings about this one personally. I feel like the writing style didn't quite work for me, but I know that it will work for a lot of other people, so I still want to recommend this one. And I still did enjoy it, it just wasn't my absolute favourite. I think that the writing style in here was a little bit blunt for me. I tend to like things that are very flowery, so it just didn't quite align with my taste. But I still really enjoyed the story and this fresh angle into the legend of King Arthur. And I think that in some ways that bluntness to the writing style did lend itself to feeling more like a myth. It felt almost like it was written in that style. If you are someone who really likes myth retellings and has maybe gotten sick of just reading Greek myth retellings over and over, then I would definitely give this one a try, especially if you like to read stories that have historically been male focused from a female lens. And I would definitely recommend Spear by Rachel Griffith. Now, I definitely can't make this video without mentioning one of my favourite books that I actually did read in a day, even though it technically is a few more pages than you'd expect, but this is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I'll be brief because I talk about this book all the time, but of course it is a children's book, so it is going to read a lot faster, even though the page count is a little bit higher. This is absolutely a comfort read for me. If you need something fairy tale-esque with a lot of humour and heart to it, then I really can't recommend anything more. If you don't know, this is the story of Sophie, who is a young woman who works in a hat shop and one day is cursed by a witch to become much older than she is, to turn into an old woman. And the only person who could possibly help her is the evil, wicked wizard Howl, who lives in a moving castle. So she sets out into the world to find this castle and this dangerous wizard and figure out a way to get him to break her curse. This is written with so much whimsy. I love Diana Wynne Jones's writing style. It feels like a warm cup of tea or reading on a window seat in the rain and the sun suddenly starting to peek out through the clouds. That is what this book feels like to me. It also, I think, has one of the most perfect endings of a book that I have read. It has one of those endings where everything weaves together and just feels so right, like it's all fallen into place. Also, can we take a minute for how gorgeous this edition is? I treated myself to the Fancy Fairy edition just because I love this book so much and I never shut up about it. So if you've somehow not heard me rant about this book before, then Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. It is properly getting dark. It's literally only 2:45 in the afternoon. It has no right to be this gloomy. But I only have a few left, so I will speed through them. The next book I would like to recommend is Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. This is again the first in a duology, and I have not read the second one yet, but I really enjoyed the first one, so definitely will be soon. They're both pretty short. But this is the story of Tobias, or the wild man of the woods. Tobias has been tethered to these woods for centuries. He tends to them and the spirits that live here, but he often also scares people of the local town because they don't understand who or what he is. But when the local hall acquires a handsome and inquisitive new owner called Henry Silver, Tobias begins to find himself connected to the mortal world more than he has been in centuries. Henry just won't leave him alone. He is a folklorist himself, and so he finds this wild man of the woods incredibly interesting. But what he doesn't seem to understand is that spending time around Tobias is putting him in danger, and will eventually uncover some secrets that would have been better left buried. This definitely has a darker twist on British folklore. Not that folklore wasn't pretty dark to begin with anyway, but it again really straddles that line between darkness and coziness, especially if you read the audiobook, which I highly recommend. I think the narrator of this book did a fantastic job. His voice is incredibly soothing and I think fits this character very well because he is very warm and gentle, especially for a strange folkloric creature. There is also a bit of a slow, gentle romance in here that I found really charming, and I'm excited to see if we get any more of that in the second installment in this series. But again, would highly recommend that audiobook if you are craving something that feels like an old children's story that you would have been read to while going to bed at night, but that has a bit more of a bite to it and feels a bit more complex and morally interesting, then would highly recommend Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. The next book I would definitely recommend as a short read is Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This story is set in an alternate 1940s Chicago, and I know I said I don't tend to read urban fantasy, but that specific brand of urban fantasy really intrigued me. This is an alternate version of our world where angels and demons are known to exist, at least by some, and a certain kind of magic can be wielded through connections with these beings. Our main character comes to us just before her soul is about to be taken because she sold it several years ago to save her brother's life. But our main character is a detective who uses her strange magic to solve mysteries, and just before her soul is taken and she has to leave the love of her life behind for good, she is offered one last job, and in payment for this job she would be given one more chance at life. So a timer starts and we follow this detective as she tries to figure out what is going on and eventually finds that she has gotten herself into something much bigger than she planned to. I think my favourite thing about this book was the voice. Our main character really embodies what I imagine a magical detective butch lesbian would have been like in the 1940s. And the exploration of queer history in this book is really interesting. The underground bars that queer people would go to at the time and the persecution that they would suffer. There are a couple of things in here that I would look up trigger warnings for if you think that that could be an area that might be difficult for you to read about, but I found that part of this book to be really interesting, and the romance in here is really sweet as well. I wouldn't say that the mystery in here was the highlight of the story. I still had a fun time following these characters along while they tried to figure out what was happening, but I think the characters themselves were definitely what was most impressive here. So if you're a character reader or you like the sound of a magical 1940s Chicago with butch lesbians, then Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. And last but definitely not least, I want to talk about something that I read this morning actually, and this is a very short story. It is only 31 pages, so if you really just want to speed something and get a win, but also read something that is strangely impactful for how short it is, then I highly recommend The 6 Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. I've heard this one recommended several times and I've been meaning to read it for a while now, so I thought that this would be the perfect time so I could include it in this video if I liked it, and I really did. As this one is so short, I really don't want to give too much away about it. As briefly as I can, this is the story of a young, sick servant girl whose life is spared by the Saint of War, and then grows up to be the most magnificent warrior that this kingdom has ever known. This is a story that folds in on itself. It has such layers of complexity for such a short narrative. This also plays around with second person a bit, which I really enjoy personally when it's done well, which I think it definitely is here. Everything about this story feels very precise and deliberate. It feels like every word is picked very carefully because it's such a short space, and the way that this concludes, it feels like such a whole narrative within just 31 pages. This feels like the perfect little shot of fantasy with the armor and the battles and the knights and the hint of magic, but also with such interesting character development within such a short space of time. This definitely hit me much harder than I expected it to for something so short. And it's gonna take so little time. What have you got to lose? I really would recommend this story to everyone who likes fantasy. This really does pack such a punch for such a short space of time. So that is 6 Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. So those are all the recommendations I have for you today. I hope that you found something new to add to your TBR that will hopefully get you out of a reading slump or help you to reach those reading goals. I know that there are a lot more sci-fi and fantasy short reads out there that I definitely want to read, but there are definitely some that I haven't found yet, so if you know of any yourself, please drop them down below. I would love to hear about them. And thank you so much for watching. I hope that if you are in a slump like me, then you get out of it very soon. Hopefully I will too. But either way, I hope you are having a lovely last couple of months of the year, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye bye.